again. So this is the 10 questions I ask every developer and the answers. And before I sort of get into what this talk is about, just to give some quick cred, the who am I, other than the guy that was obnoxious to the city councilwoman that got called out and was successfully then made fun of by my fellow employee, Megan and Chris and everyone else. I run a company called 10up. We do big websites with WordPress for the most part. Some of the customers that we do work with are on this screen, companies like Time Inc. We help TechCrunch do their website. We work with Consumer Reports, with AARP. We've done a project for Google. We do lots of work with big customers. And if you want to empathize with my mockery throughout this day, you can like us on Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter. We're 25 people. We're always looking for new talent. And that's what 10up is. So in the course of building a company, this company 10up, in the course of being in leadership roles at previous agencies, some of which did WordPress, some of which was before WordPress was really a thing, before there were WordCamps, I think I've looked back at the math, and I've probably interviewed over 175 candidates for positions, most of which were for technical or developer positions. I've been responsible for hiring over 45 people. Of that 45, probably somewhere between 30 and 35 are people for specifically doing development or doing work with WordPress. So I've done a little bit of hiring, a little bit of recruiting, and learned some lessons from that. I'm really lucky to have found some really amazing people that I have the privilege of working with. You had the fortune of seeing one person that I'm lucky to work with, Megan Gray, earlier today. I'm lucky to have a lot of rock stars that I have a chance to learn from, to grow with. I've also made some really bad hires. I've made some really big mistakes in hiring, some of which didn't even last a month, some of which we trudged through for 7, 8 months before we realized it was a mistake. And I've probably learned as much from what worked in hiring as I have from what didn't work in hiring and what I misjudged. First principle for people that are looking to hire a developer or want to hire a developer or looking to add more people is, and I'm just going to spend a moment on this, is what you're not looking for. This is what you're not looking for. You're not looking for a salesman. You're not looking for somebody that's polished, that's going to come in, that's going to talk your ear off. In fact, the best developers that you're looking for, if you're trying to hire somebody to be perfectly candid about it, the bargains, the opportunities are the people that maybe aren't so polished, that maybe are a little bit rough around the edges, that aren't going to come in and wow you and razzle-dazzle you at a talk. They're spending less time doing things like I'm doing right now and giving talks and glad handling and networking, and spending a lot more time writing code and getting geeky and spending time not polishing their shoes. So when I talk to a candidate for a developer position, I really break that conversation down into 3 parts. The first part of the conversation is does the candidate get the platform? Are we wasting our time here? Kind of questions. Do you understand the basics that I expect you to understand if you want to be a professional WordPress developer? Do you know what this platform is about? Have you done something more than create a blog once? It's amazing sometimes somebody that calls themselves, I think other people alluded to this earlier in the day, expert WordPress developers, or I see resumes where they say 5 years of experience with WordPress, or in one case, more years of experience with WordPress than it existed. When you see 10, 15 years of experience with WordPress, you have to scratch your head. And then don't actually show up to talk about the technology and don't really have a lot to say. Second group of questions is about getting at how much this person's actually done with WordPress. We'll talk more about this, but the second group of questions these questions I tell every developer that I interview, these are not pass-fail questions. These aren't questions that if you don't know the answers means there's not a job for you here. Probably half or more than half, at least half the people I hire don't know the answers to all these questions. It's me trying to gauge where along the spectrum of expert are you? What really are you worth? Are you somebody that's going to come in here and just knows everything and rock it on day one? Or do you still have some stuff you need to learn? Is there going to be a mentoring process? Do you have a ways to go? Either one is fine, but it changes the equation and their value. The final group of questions is, does the candidate think critically? Okay, you can write code, you know the ins and outs of WordPress, but when you get stuck with those challenging questions, those hard situations where I'm not telling you go build this exactly, do you think about your work? Do you think about your questions? So there's a couple of rules that I'll tell the developers as I'm talking to them. This is what we're doing here. This is the goal. The first rule is that there's not always one right answer to these questions. Most of these questions are not sort of like a simple binary, this is the exact right answer, this is the definition, this is the function name. They're questions that there's an opportunity for a little bit of creativity. There are better and worse answers. There are answers that, like, yes, that you nailed it, and there are answers of, okay, you kind of get it. And then there's answers that really aren't great answers, but might be a solution. There are some very wrong answers, even though there's not a right answer. There are some answers that are just completely not in the right ballpark. And finally, and this is what I call like the SAT rule for my interviews, saying that I don't know or I'm not familiar with that is a lot better than making some crap up and telling it to me. I can respect a developer when I ask a hard WordPress engineering question about transient APIs or object caching that just says, you know what, I haven't done much with that yet, but I want to learn. I can respect that. What I can't respect is somebody that confidently makes up a bunch of garbage and tries to confidently tell it to me as the answer. Because when I actually work with that person, if I'm going to actually hire this person, I need to, what does that say about their honesty? What does that say about being able to trust this candidate? Good developers, good people, good anybody in a position knows when to say I don't know, or knows when to say I need help. So those are the rules. So let's get into the questions. First group of questions are what I consider to be sort of beginner dev kind of questions, people just getting into WordPress. This is what I call the honestly now, do you know WordPress with a lowercase p questions. And no, you don't lose your job if you spell it with a lowercase p, but if you're going to say you're an expert in WordPress, you've done it for 5 years, a good tip is to spell it correctly in your resume and your cover letter. So let's talk about some basic WordPress development. The first question I'm going to ask you, if you want to be a WordPress developer at 10 Up, is tell me what a hook is, and talk about the two basic hooks in WordPress and the difference between them. If we have more time, we can do this interactive, but I know everybody wants to move along here. So here's a wrong answer that I've gotten from somebody that was clearly more on the marketing side of thinking. We could talk about a marketing job. We could talk about a project management job. But if you think hooks in WordPress are about killer features to rope you in, we're not really talking about the same job here.
Typically just a few seconds long. A hook is, right? Then
you get into that awkward part of, OK, we've been interviewing for 5 minutes. How do I not rudely end this interview now? Another wrong answer is that it's a way to extend WordPress, which is not wrong, but then to explain that those ways of extending WordPress are plugins and themes. Plugins and themes are sort of different kinds of modules in WordPress, which are used to extend it. They are not hooks. They are not the API way you extend WordPress. So what is the right answer in this section to what a hook is? So starting with a formal definition, a hook is a technique used to alter or augment the behavior of software. So in WordPress, these things that let you alter or augment the behavior of WordPress fall into two categories. There are action hooks in WordPress, and there are filter hooks in WordPress. Action hooks are hooks that WordPress launches at specific intervals during execution. So there are places in WordPress where it says in the core code, and I don't know if this person's still here. Somebody asked earlier about, I think during your session, Sterling, about like how do I alter these core things in WordPress, these core behaviors. Action hooks basically are in core code and say, when you get here, let the user jump in here. Let a developer jump in here and do something extra. In WordPress, adding an action, hooking into those action hooks takes the form of a function called add_action. It takes the name of the hook that you're trying to hook to. So for example, there's a hook in WordPress called WP_footer. So if you want to jump in that WP footer hook, which runs at the bottom before you close your document tags in a theme, you would hook into WP_footer. The second argument is a callback function. So it's the name of the function that you want to run when it gets there. This is the name of your own function, or any function really, available in PHP, that when it gets to that hook that you want to run. And then there are two optional arguments, the priority. We're not going to get into all the details, but the priority, so where along the spectrum of all these other hooks that might jump in there do you want to run? You want to run it super early before anybody else gets in? You want to run it super late after everybody else has hooked in? And then the final argument, which is where it gets a little bit more technical if you're beginner developers, is sometimes hooks can pass multiple arguments into your function. So they might pass back some information that you want to work with, like the name of the post that you're altering. And so the number of arguments that you want to pass back is the last argument. If you look up add action on the codex, if you go to the action API, you can read to your heart's content in far more detail than I'm going to get into about how action hooks work. Filters are functions that WordPress passes data through at certain points in execution just before taking some action with the data. So it takes a very similar form to add actions, except it takes the name of the thing you want to hook into, the name of your function that you want to run. When it gets there, same deal with priority and accepted arguments, except whenever you run a filter, you're sending something back. If actions just run and say, hey, now's your chance to jump in and do something, filters say, hey, I've got something here. Do you want to do something to this before you go about it? You're filtering something. You're modifying something in WordPress. And again, if you go to the codex and read about the filter hooks, there's tons of documentation to explain this in a lot more detail. The difference between the two, again, action hooks run at certain points, filters modify information that WordPress is dealing with. Question number 2, explain what a taxonomy is. A way to preserve unused code, sometimes known as taxidermy, is not the answer that we're looking for. Also not the answer are various types of content in WordPress, which I've heard a couple times. Posts, pages, media, menus, etc. are not taxonomies in WordPress. So what are taxonomies? Taxonomy, simply put, is a way to group things together. WordPress, most people know 2 very public, very exposed, long-time exposed taxonomies that WordPress has for posts out of the box. Those are categories and tags, which are ways of grouping posts together. WordPress has an API to let you register other taxonomies, add other ways of classifying content as a developer. There are a few lesser-known taxonomies. There are actually 3 lesser-known taxonomies in WordPress. I will make this part interactive. Can any developers in this room identify for me the 3 lesser-known built-in taxonomies in WordPress?
Take a stab. Are transients a form of taxonomy?
No.
Okay.
Post formats.
Yes. Okay. One of the 3 others is post formats, newer to WordPress, which is why a lot of people don't think of it. It's going to get really hot in 3.6 with themes, but still relatively young in WordPress world. Anybody can name the 2 more subtle ones? I'll give you a small clue. One's pretty new to WordPress and very subtle how it's exposed. One is very old to WordPress and barely used anymore. All right, so link category is the very old one. May it rest in peace. It's still in there in core. You can still turn on the links menu and add links, which are in their own tables. There's a custom taxonomy to put links in categories together. Navigation menus is the one that's newer, that's a lot more subtle. So when you group menus together, you say this is the name of my menu, and I'm going to put all these objects in that menu. That menu, that grouping of all those menu items is a taxonomy in WordPress. It's a grouping of menu items. And then you touched on post formats, which is another newer, little less subtle one. So those are bonus point answers. All right, this also goes back to the question I think Sterling was asked about what do you do if you don't know what a function does? So let's say I'll pick some random function in WordPress that's esoteric and most developers may not have touched. Let's say you see, which is a real function in WordPress, so let's say you see WP_list_filter, a WordPress function for the first time. How do you figure out what this does? Throw it out to the audience. Where would you start? Be honest. The codex? So Sterling gets bonus points. So not a wrong answer, but not really the answer that I'm looking for here. Yes, like in all things in life, if you don't know what it is, you can go to Google and hope for an answer there. That's good, but that doesn't tell me you know anything special about WordPress. A little bit better, not a bad place to look first, but if you give me the answer to the codex, I'm going to say, OK, cool, the codex. You go there. It's not in the codex, or it's not really explained at all in the codex. It just lists it as a function with a couple of parameters. What do you do next? Sterling's right in the money. It's open source software. That means that the code is all there for you to look at. Go look at it in the source code. Every developer I know that has gone from good developer to great developer gets comfortable with the idea of going and looking up these functions in core and seeing what core is doing under the hood. If you use a good software development package like PHP Storm or NetBeans or Eclipse, full IDEs, you can very easily click on functions when you define them and go right into them in core code. We bend over backwards as core developers to make sure that we use PHP doc standards, which is this block of comments you see above the function definition, to make sure that they're well defined. We are arduous about things like formatting and indenting and good code standards. We even have rules that say things like don't be clever with code. It's better for it to be readable and understandable than it is for it to be super clever. It's not as scary as you think. Great developers tell me that they go just look up the function. You had a question?
Sorry, that was a throw in. But do you think somebody could be a good programmer, a good WordPress developer, if they haven't been a good PHP programmer beforehand? They got into WordPress and are dedicated and have done a lot of web development and they learned a lot about it, but they haven't gone the kind of classical PHP programmer in WordPress.
So I have seen people that never touched PHP before WordPress and become very good developers. I would say, and just for time's sake, I'm going to get back to the main questions. We can circle back around and talk about it more. So I do think it's possible to be a very good WordPress developer. I don't think you'll ever be a phenomenal developer. If you don't, you'll never be that other stratosphere if you don't have some of the basic concepts and knowledge of programming. I can tell you consistently, people that I've seen that went through like a computer science program or went through a programming theory or really studied fundamental programming always end up skyrocketing beyond the developers that are just really hard workers that are approaching it from a practical standpoint. In fact, the only people that I will hire as developers that have not already had good practical experience with WordPress are good people with strong educations and strong knowledge of the underlying languages that seem to be able to demonstrate a competency and core knowledge to pick things like this up quickly. So you think you're good at this is part two. All right, you know what WordPress is, you know taxonomy is not dead code, but do you actually? But now let's push you a little bit. So this will be a little bit more interesting, I think, to the developers that are getting on the more advanced, more expert spectrum. So let's talk about sanitizing and validating data and what that means for WordPress. For time's sake, I'm going to skip some of the interactive, just go to the answers. I can tell you that not the right answer is just which I've heard, it's just checking database integrity, making sure your database didn't get corrupted, that information hasn't been spoiled in the database. Not what sanitizing and validating data means. Testing data to make sure it's what you expected. It's a fine layman explanation. If I asked you what ice cream is and you told me it's a dessert, it's not wrong, but I'm going to ask you for more information about what this means and applying that to WordPress. So here's the concept of validating and sanitizing data. And I think, Megan, you were talking about like when you were first getting into development, what it meant for like injected code and things being pushed in to the database. So the concept here is untrusted data comes from many sources. We don't trust our users to enter data exactly the way we expected. We might be pulling remote data from Twitter or Facebook or wherever from across the web that we can't count on being in the correct format. Even our own database. What's been put in the database before. All of this needs to be validated on both input and output. We need to make sure that when we receive data, before we store it, that it's the way we expect it to be. When we retrieve data to display it or put it on the screen, we need to make sure, again, that it's in the format, in the condition we expect it to be. WordPress has a very large library of functions intended to help you make sure that you can sanitize and validate your data, in addition to all the PHP functions that are built in. So a simple example in PHP, forgetting WordPress for a second, would be something like intval, or typecasting as an int. If you're expecting it to be an integer, a positive number without decimals, and so you're getting data out of your post meta, let's say, right? And you want to make sure that when you display on the screen that this was in fact a number, you might apply the intval function to it. WordPress has a lot of functions that help us. There's things for HTML fragments, making sure your HTML is in the state that you expect it to be, for text nodes, for attributes. We'll talk about a few examples. There's a pretty neat function that WordPress uses throughout, which for those of you that have tried to use the WordPress editor to be Dreamweaver have probably been driven crazy by, called WP Kisses. What WP Kisses does is it takes a string, it takes a block of textual data as its first argument. It then takes an array of allowed HTML tags. You can define the HTML tags you want to be acceptable to use in that string. If you want to get more complicated here, and again, you can look up WP Kisses. If you want to get more complicated, it's a multi-dimensional array. So in that array, there are other arrays. So you can say, like, one tag that's allowed is A, the anchor tag, right? And then underneath that, there's another array of all the attributes we allow for that tag. The ref attribute, the title attribute, for example. Optionally, there's a third argument to this function, allowed protocols, which you can say for links, what are the allowed protocols, HTTP, HTTPS, FTP, all the other ones we never use anymore. And what this will do, this function will do, is it will go through that first string, that HTML that you passed it, and clean it up, getting rid of any tags and attributes that's not allowed. This is what WordPress uses if you're not an administrator to clean up your posts when you save it. So if you try to inject script or you try to inject bad HTML tags, especially on places like WordPress.com where safety is paramount, that's what it uses to strip out that kind of content. Another great example is escape HTML. So I don't know if I go to, didn't mean to do that. I don't know if any of you have, so let's actually go back to escape HTML. I'm going to talk about actually a different one, escape_attr, which is escape attributes. So let's say I have an image, right? And I want to give somebody a field to change the title attribute for the image. Everybody know what I'm talking about? HTML tag has a title attribute. So let's say I give them a field, and a custom field. I make a custom field available to them in WordPress where they can enter what they want for the title. Let's say they put in that title, you know, my name is quote Jake, unquote. What happens if I just plain old spit that out in the middle of a title equals attribute? Gonna break your tag, because that quote mark ends that attribute, right? If I just put a raw quotation character in there, it's gonna go, my name is, end of title attribute. What escape_esc_attr does is it goes through there, finds all the quotation marks, single and double quotation marks, and converts them to what we call entities, like and non-breaking space is an entity. Converts them to entities so it won't break attributes. Escape HTML will take, which is meant for like a text area tag, will take anything that's an opening caret and convert that to an entity so you don't accidentally close your text area tag. That's sanitizing data. There's an escape URL function. If you want to make sure that something got past the proper URL, you can sanitize it. So if I passed in google.com, this will say what you really meant is http://google.com. I'm not going to get into all of them. They're even database. Sanitization and validation filters. So if you're working with the WPDB class and getting more sophisticated and trying to put stuff right in the database or pull stuff out, there are functions in there to make sure that your data is clean, that it's safe from injection hacks and other common mistakes. Even file system sanitization and validation. All right, so let's get, I know everybody's having fun with like the hard tech questions at this hour, but let's get even a little bit harder. So this is what I almost always ask, would be expert developers. Let's say you have a client, and they have this requirement that they want you to be able to selectively, on their blog homepage, be at the front of their website or a blog section, they want to selectively be able to say, I don't want these posts to appear in the blog home. How would you achieve that? Open-ended. How would you solve that problem?
There's a few questions I have on it. Does it need to not show up just on the homepage or throughout the entire site?
Just on the homepage. They want it to show up in categories. They want it to show up in tags. They can go directly to the post. They just don't want it to show up in their main.
You can have a special tag you can have a special tag, a special category, or you can have a custom taxonomy, a series of options. There's a myriad of ways you can do that.
Oh, that's a custom post type too.
You could say not dash home as a tag.
OK, so from a user experience standpoint, you'd say let's add a tag. And what did you say?
Well, to me, that's a indicator that they have a different type of content.
Maybe,
Why
but
is
let's
it
say
present on the homepage?
let's say they just post a ton and they want the homepage to be the best of their content.
So they just featured.
Yeah.
That's a taxonomy. That's grouping posts. So I probably use a term for that.
How about take it now the next step, which is how would you actually achieve it in code? How would you remove that from the home index?
Filter the query.
Filter the query. Could you be more specific?
I would use the parse query action.
Close. Not bad.
Pre-query filter.
Close.
Yeah.
You're pretty close. Tom, I'll keep going. So what's interesting to me, Sterling, the first thing he talked about was using a taxonomy. So one of the interesting things about this question, there's really two parts to this question, right? The first part of this question is, what's the user experience? How does a user actually select those posts? There's a second part to the question, which is, now that you've figured out your user interface, how do you technically actually remove it from showing up on that page in WordPress? And people that choose to answer one or the other, or really focus on one or the other, is very illustrative to me when we're talking about whether somebody's more user experience minded and or more sort of engineering minded. So let's talk about user approach first. One not bad, but I think not great approach is to use a category or a tag. or something to designate as not being on the home page. A better answer that I would say is pretty good is to add a custom meta box, a new box on the WordPress screen with a field in there called something like exclude this from the home page with a checkbox, post meta. The real like bonus super extra credit point, rock stars, which people have told me this and I've been impressed, would be to use a action hook in WordPress. I'm talking about hooks called post underscore submit box underscore miss underscore actions. This is a hook in WordPress that runs right above the publish button in that publish box where you can select the date that you want it to be published, save it as a draft. In that box, there's a hook where you can insert other fields. So that's the name of that hook. So the real rock stars tell me they would hook into that box and add a new checkbox right above the publish button saying, don't show this on the home page. Technical approach. This is the answer that makes me cringe. This is the only question in this section that might make me say, it's been fun. Don't call me, I'll call you. So, yeah. If anybody has a way to do that awkward, like, we're done now, please let me know. But in any case, so the absolute worst answer, but I hear it all the time, is inside the loop, inside that place where you loop through the posts in WordPress, it would write an if statement around that post saying if it's in that post meta we talked about, or if it's in that tag, continue. And then I say, OK, well, suppose that there are 10 posts per page as a setting, right? And let's say that of those last 10 posts, 7 of them were checked off as don't show on home page. How about if 10 of them were checked off as don't show on the home page? Now it's on your home page. Nothing is on your home page. You don't want to actually just reduce the number of items that you're showing on the home page. You just don't want to show some. Also a wrong answer, but not one that's a end of interview answer, we need to get you a little bit further answer. Write a new query posts at the top of your home.php or at the top of your template for your home page, re-executing a new query that excludes that tag or excludes that meta or whatever the case might be. Not the right answer. 2 reasons I'll say this is the wrong answer. The first one is almost every time someone does this, although this can be fixed, they always forget to deal with paginations. What happens when you click the next button? Every time you load that template, it's going back to that first set of posts. You have to remember to figure things in, like what page you're on, getting the page, and all this information. The main reason this is the wrong answer is because you just wasted a cycle. You just did 2 queries. WordPress already went and got all the posts, and now you're saying go get this new set of posts. You're wasting the query that it did to begin with to generate the home page and doing a whole new one. This is the real right answer to this question, which is there is an action hook, albeit a strange, confusing action hook in WordPress because it passes a direct reference to the object, to the WP query object that you can change. There's a pre-get post hook in WordPress. This runs before absolutely any query runs. For menus, for category pages, for any kind of post query in WordPress, the pre-get posts hook runs. And what that hook does, it says, wait, before you actually go to the database and run this, here's your chance to get in and change what this query is for. So you can use pre-get posts to modify the query before it runs. So we'll hook in to pre-get posts, pass the name of my callback function, exclude category. And this example, which is not really the ideal post-meta way to do it, but just to not focus on what we're changing, but how we change it, we would say, into that callback function, we get the WP query, we get our query object that's about to run, and we can say, if this query is for the home page, if it's for the main query, which means the one that runs for the initial page load as opposed to maybe some other get posts you have elsewhere on the page, if it's under those 2 conditions, change the query that you're about to run. Tell me about your favorite function in WordPress. This is an interesting question to ask people that profess to be great developers. So before I go through some answers I have, I'll make this, we'll run short in time. Anybody have favorite functions in WordPress?
List plot.
WP list plot. Good answer. I got this one up here. Good answer. You get bonus points. Anybody else have a favorite function in WordPress? It can be a simple one that they use all the time.
I like the HTTP API that they've got.
OK.
Allow you to pass headers and do that kind of stuff.
Yep.
Within WordPress.
Yep. All right, let's go to some of mine. This is known as Andrew Nason, one of the lead core developers' favorite functions. There's a function in WordPress called media sideload image. Media sideload image takes 3 arguments. It takes a path to an image. It can be a URL on an external website. It can be something local. You can literally pass it the URL of some external website. It takes the ID of the post in WordPress that you want to attach that image to. And then it takes optionally a description of that image, like a title for that image. And it will literally go retrieve that image, suck it into WordPress, and make it attached to the post that you specify. So this is used in things like when you're people that are pulling content remotely. It's used like in the WordPress importer API to go get those images that are attached to posts remotely and suck it in. I don't know how many use cases there are for it for most developers, but it's a pretty cool function that's built right in. It takes something that's actually very hard and tedious to walk through and makes it super simple. This is my favorite WordPress function, human time diff. So all this function does is it takes the starting point, maybe that's today, and the end point, maybe that's the date of the post date, and generates a human time difference like 5 minutes ago, 2 hours. So it takes something that's kind of tedious and actually kind of, if you look at it in core code, kind of painful to make, to rip apart and do, which is just showing like nice human stamps, like this post was published 5 minutes ago, and makes it super simple. Somebody mentioned WP pluck. This loops, this will, if you have like, in WordPress, there's a lot of times you have an array of objects, like here's all the posts, right? Or here's all of the categories, objects in an array. You can specify the name of a field in those objects in that array, and it will go loop through them for you and pull all those fields out into a new array for you. So let's say you have all of your posts objects in an array, and all you want is the titles, or all you want is the IDs of those posts. You can with WP pluck, I can say the list is the name of that variable that's holding all those post objects. The field would be ID if I wanted ID, and it will return an array with just the IDs. Doing it wrong is technically an internal function that we're not supposed to use in WordPress, but what this does is if somebody calls a function in a certain way, you can trigger, if they have WP debug turned on, you can trigger a warning message on their screen and give them some feedback. All right, say, last hard technical question. This is where we get the real pros. Say you needed to retrieve some data from a remote source once a day. Tell me about some of the WordPress APIs you would use to accomplish this task. Anybody want to throw out? You mentioned one of them.
So the API, and then you use the built-in cron.
Yep. So it's pretty much exactly right. So not a lot of people know, but there is like what we call the WP cron APIs, or functions in WordPress to handle scheduling events. There's a function in WordPress called WP schedule event that takes the first time you want to run that event, the reoccurrence that you want to happen. The built-in ones are hourly, twice daily, and daily. You can add other ones through filters. And then the name of the callback function you want to run when that event occurs. For time's sake, I'm not going to walk through all of the way that this works with the way you have to hook into actions. You can read about WP schedule event on the codex. There's a lot of good documentation for the cron API. But do know that there are scheduling event functions in WordPress. Second function to know about is WP remote posts, or what Sterling referred to as the HTTP API. So there are functions in WordPress to make things that are can be very tedious, very painful, and very imprecise, like curl, right? Or what if curl's not available in the server, that take the process of remotely sending or remotely retrieving data and make it a lot more simple. One example is WP_remote_post. All of these arguments below in the array are optional. The only thing you need to pass WP remote post is a URL. What it will do is it will go out to that URL, just like as if your browser did, and pull back whatever that URL returns when you go there and give it back to you. Remoting APIs. And then for extra credit, if I'm telling you to go out and retrieve remote data, transform it, do something with it, and display it, you probably want to cache when you're done, so you're not constantly running that operation every time you load the page. There's an API in WordPress called the Transients API that lets you basically cache objects of data, cache little bits of data. Again, for time and everybody's sanity at this hour, I'm not going to go fully into the Transient API. Again, it's well documented. If you're going to do big WordPress development and things at scale and complex operations, you should know some of how caching works in WordPress. OK, so we've done some beginner dev questions. We've done some hard dev questions. Have a little bit more fun now. Let's talk about what I want to know once I get a sense for developer skill set about their ability to think, their ability to process data. So we'll whiz through these. Tell me what you think the most interesting trend or thing to watch in our spaces. Was it 10 minutes? Or am I out of time?
You entrance me and we're done.
OK. Do I have time to run through these? I just got to.
No.
OK.
Everybody's
Asleep? Yeah. So I'll put this out just quickly, 'cause I don't have many slides left. What do people think is interesting right now in the broader web WordPress space?
I keep a pulse on the roadmap and tracks that they do, so get a preview of the changes that are coming out.
Okay. Not just how to, but like what is interesting at the moment. What?
The admin UI?
Admin UI. Doesn't just have to be WordPress. Like this is like what, just in general in our space, what are the trends to watch? What are you interested in?
I think just generally that clients that don't know anything about web or anything else are bringing up the word, oh, I heard about WordPress.
So adoption, knowledge about our tools in the broader public,
Yeah.
and what that means, which we know Chris loves when they ask about specific tools. So just some great answers that I've heard for time's sake. Mobile first and the evolution of responsive design is a good answer. I think people that are really passionate about what it means to have devices of almost infinite sizes now. I mean, I think in my home office now for testing, I have probably 4 or 5 different screen size devices. What does this mean? We talk about mobile first and starting with mobile. What does that really mean? We debate that sometimes at 10 Up. Does that just mean that when you're done with the design, you do the CSS for mobile first and go up? Does it mean you start with storyboards for mobile? What does mobile first really mean? High DPI, I think is interesting. High DPI discussion reminds me of responsive design and mobile optimization in 2009 when you talk to a customer about optimizing for mobile device and they kind of go, yeah, and how much does it cost? Does anybody really care about this? Dude, that's high DPI right now. How many people really use these screens? How big of a difference does it make? Probably within the next couple of years, as more manufacturers other than Apple rolls out high DPI displays and costs come down, everything will be high DPI. It's going to be something that we're going to have to start facing. Meaningful social media integration. By meaningful social media integration, I do not mean you have a like button on your posts or a tweet this button. That's not. I think a discussion about what the next level of real social media integration is an interesting conversation. Not just from a technical side, which is a problem, because things like Open Graphs API are very clumsy and very cluttered, but what it even means from a privacy perspective. When we have a brainstorm about something like, if I could show you on my products page what your friends also bought from this products page, let's say we can do that. Is it a good idea?
Should we do it?
Should we do it? I think this is an interesting area to watch. Explosion of devices, this is like responsive design, what it means to have so many breakpoints. I mean, we all moaned and groaned if we were developers that were around 5 years ago about the different browsers and the incompatibilities. I'm getting kind of squirmy when I go to meetups, and I hear at every single meetup, my friend has this Android tablet that I've never seen, and this broke, on their device. Like, you think testing between 3 different clients was bad? I think the explosion of devices, web browsers, and everything is going to pose some real interesting challenges for us. Typography, I think we're just starting to get interesting with typography. It reminds me a little bit of like when images first came out on the web and we're kind of just doing typography because it's cool, and even if it's a horrible typographic choice, we love it because it's not Arial or Times New Roman. I don't think people are very thoughtful at this point about typography. Question 9, whizzing through, what frustrates you about WordPress? You've talked to me about, 10 Up and WordPress, and it's the best thing ever. Okay, well, there's some things that suck about WordPress. Tell me what drives you nuts about WordPress. And now people want to talk. Yeah. Yeah.
It's about, when you compare it to other content management systems, if I take expression engines, you can make fields a bit of data, but if you want to turn WordPress into a full content management system, you're probably going to, unless you're a superb coder like yourself, you're probably going to use external plugins. And then I'll get a bit swervy about having to rely on some very good external plugins.
So a lot of
do something very fundamental.
A lot of common CMS kind of functionality being dependent if you're not an expert on outside dependencies. I think that's very true of like frameworks. A lot of us depend on frameworks to do our business. We heard a lot of talk about frameworks today. It makes me a little squirmy that we're so dependent on these commercial, 1-2 person shop centric framework products. I know people want to talk now.
The inconsistency between naming of functions, so like you can get the title, so get the title, but the permalink is get permalink instead of get the permalink.
So some of the clumsiness and just multiple developers and inconsistency in how we name function behavior.
I think the lack of a standard for separating content from configuration. So if you've got the configuration, plugin settings, things that you need to set up and deploy into production, that's totally very hard to separate from the
I see.
content of the database.
Right.
So just like deployment issues like that. But I think a clear separation of configuration that would
Taking configuration, maybe.
separate from the content.
Good answer. For time's sake, I'm going to just go through some good answers I've heard. Taxonomy term architecture can be improved. So this is one that drives me the most nuts. Our term, if you want to get geeky, our term taxonomy architecture under WordPress in the database is very broken. It was not well conceived. I know what they were trying to do, but it wasn't well thought out. As a result of this, and because of our absolute deference to infinite compatibility, getting that fixed so we can start doing things like term metadata is in the way. There are no formal methods to create direct relationships between two content objects. You can fake this with post-meta, but most good app engine kind of platforms allow you to have direct links one-to-one, like a joining table between two posts or between two content objects. That's clumsy in WordPress. User interface answers are good. It doesn't just have to be coding answers. Here are a lot of critiques of things like the widgets navigation screen, right, where you have to click, drag it, pull the screen down, hold on to your touchpad for dear life, and slide it into that widget box that was closed already. So I think widgets, menus, which are getting better in 3.6, there's a lot of room for user interface improvement. There's lots of areas in WordPress that don't handle conflicts all that well between plugins. My favorite example of this is the menu system. If you try to, when you register a post type or you add a custom menu in WordPress, if you try to define a position, and then somebody else tries to define the exact same specific position, whoever goes last overwrites the first one. There's no conflict handling for things like menu items. Last question, this is the feel-good question. Why do you want to work with WordPress day in and out? Why do you want to be here? Why WordPress? Answers I've heard, it's becoming the dominant CMS on the web and growing. It's not a bad answer. You want to be in technology. You want to get behind what's popular. WordPress is certainly getting popular. It's the only platform where customers don't call me back every month asking for retraining. I hear that one a lot. A lot of people that ultimately abandon other platforms because they tell me these stories where I train them and every week they're calling back. Every time someone leaves, they really don't. They have a bunch of sticky notes in front of their desk for how to do point A to Z. A well put together WordPress implementation usually makes customers drive you less crazy with just maintenance tasks, happier customers. This is another great answer I hear from some real geeky developers that run Linux on their computers, and some of which we have in our team. They love open source. They want to be part of something. I have people that have come from the lucrative, high-end enterprise .NET space, which I'm sorry to say still pays more than WordPress and PHP pays, and they're perfect, and they are actually willing to take pay cuts because they just don't want to work in these closed proprietary platforms. They want to be in open source. They want to be contributing something back to WordPress and to products. Believing in the philosophy of open source and GPL is a good reason for a developer. The community, right? To close on that, I think this is probably the answer I hear the most, and it's a good one. I think part of the reason that I ultimately, in having worked with a lot of different platforms 4 or 5 years ago, dabbling in WordPress, doing some Drupal, tinkering with Expression Engine, I think what probably ultimately pulled me to WordPress is there was no other place I could go to this kind of camp on a regular basis. There was no other community. There's no other community I think like this in the space. And that's my running really late, feel good answer.
All right.
Yeah.